The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Welcome to the show, everybody. We're glad to have you here, and I'd like to let everybody know that this is a live call-in show. You can call and speak your mind, whatever, challenge us, ask a question, add something, correct us. 343-9927, 343-9927, and by us, I mean Lang Baker. Evening, Lang.
Howdy, Wayne.
Good to have you here, and our topic for tonight is the connection, if any, or the social consequences associated with lobbying and lobbyists, both in Washington and state levels, actually state or local too. But general, monetary and other contributions to certain government officials and how those things negatively impact our society. Things that, problems that we have today that are caused largely by influence peddling in Washington and state governments. So, Lang, let's kick us off here. You found that there was a connection between, at least at the federal level, lobbying and campaign contributions, right?
Yeah, I came across this list of the various ways that influence is brought to bear, which includes campaign contributions and lobbyists, which are professional advocates that are hired to go in and talk to government officials about getting what they want. And one of the ways that those two are interlinked is the same people that make the contributions are paying the lobbyist, or they are the lobbyists, and that gets the door open so that they can get access to the people making the decisions.
So if you want, I guess it's if you want to be able to influence a politician, first you have to make sure they remain in office or get into office, so you contribute to the campaign. And then once they see what a great guy you are for helping them, they'll be more inclined to talk to you once they're in office.
Yeah, well, some of the influence is through targeting for instance, members of Congress who are on the committees that consider legislation that affects whatever your interest area is. So you see things like people sitting on the natural resources committees or regulating oil and gas and the fossil fuels who get a lot of contributions from those industries. For example, our senator and Congressman Graves, one of his largest contributors is from the oil and gas industry. Mm-hmm. He's also on the Transportation Committee, and he gets a lot of contributions from that industry.
I'd be willing to bet, and that's one of the lobbyists that I found and learned a few things about. But I'd be willing to bet the people that lobby for or try to promote climate change denial probably contribute to him, and all Louisiana politicians really. The highway construction industry, I'm sure they do, and because those are all important issues here in Louisiana.
Yeah, well, if you look at three of the four committees that Senator Cassidy sits on, energy and natural resources, well, oil and gas is one of his biggest contributors. He sits on the Finance Committee. Securities investment interests are another one of his top four contributors. And he sits on the Health, Education, and Labor and Pensions. Well, with health, it's not surprising that health professionals are his number one contributor, that industry. So that shows the connection. You get the contributions that you can get in the door and make your presentation to the person who has received all this money from you for their campaigns.
Right.
And then there's the revolving door, which is another factor in how these work together. And the revolving door is where either former members of Congress or the former staff members of Congress work for the lobbying firms, and so even though they can't for a certain period of time come directly to you, they can in effect, write the script for
Yep.
other members of their lobbying firm.
Tell them who to
Tell
talk to, what
who
to
to talk
say,
to,
yeah.
and what to say, and when's the best time during the legislative process to bring pressure to bear, and all the ins and outs of how the system works on the inside.
Okay, but it's not just federal legislators that do that. Wasn't there a notable Louisiana governor that did that?
Fill me in on the details there, Wayne.
Well, I thought you were telling me earlier that, oh no, senator. That she was all right, I was thinking she was a governor, but no. Yeah, Mary Landrieu, you said was the
Yeah,
lobbyist.
she is an example of a revolving door participant. There was a story that came out. Let's see, right here, right after, shortly after she was defeated, where she went to work for a lobbying firm that specializes in energy, and she had been the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, and the biggest contributor to her campaigns was the same lobbying firm that she and her one of her leading staff members. Both of them went to work for this firm afterwards.
Yeah, well, it's also possible that she just happened to know these people on a casual basis because of their lobbying. Could have been innocent, Plus, she probably wasn't expecting to lose the last election, and she probably ran up a huge mortgage on her house and everything else because that's what people in America tend to do when they have the money, But and the reason I'm bringing that up is to dovetail into one of the lobbyists, well, actually a couple of the lobbyists that I found related to the housing industry. The first is the housing industry itself, the real estate agencies, construction companies, and the like. There's an article here in Bloomberg News by Jared Dillon where he says he could never understand why people would want to pay money to someone so that they could get some of it back, which is, and I remember people telling me as a young man, oh, you should buy a house. It's a great tax deduction. And I just couldn't understand, I just couldn't make sense of that. And then as I got older and really thought about it and learned a few things, I realized that's baloney, because I'm still paying interest. And, oh, yeah, I can get a tax break on the interest. But what Mr. Dillion points out here is, Dillion, he points out that it's basically a subsidy for home buyers. It reduces your interest rate effectively, so people have more of an incentive to buy bigger and more expensive houses. And I had a friend from high school who went used his GI Bill to get his MBA, and he went to work on Wall Street. And he told me one time that that was behind 30-year mortgages when they were created. It was so that it would benefit the banking industry, the real estate industry, the construction industry, and all related industries by allowing people to buy bigger and more expensive houses than they normally would with a 15-year loan, because the interest rates, the monthly payments would be lower, spread out over 30 years, but they'd end up paying a whopping, larger amount for the house, but it was over a long period of time, so people didn't care. But these are things like this, and of course, the consequences of the tax break for home mortgage interest, and also the 30-year mortgage, and any kind of encouragement to buy more and more expensive houses has created a glut of debt in the country, which we paid for back in 2007, 2008 with the housing crash, because they had gone out and sold or pushed so many risky loans on people that they knew weren't qualified to pay them back, and then the whole thing fell apart. Another downside of the lobbying industry, for housing anyway, I thought of was the idea of redlining. And we talked about this, no, actually maybe you didn't, it was another guest and I talked about it. The idea of redlining is where in poorer communities, mostly in cities, the federal mortgage corporations, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac or whatever, will not allow mortgages in these older, poorer neighborhoods. And of course, most of them are inhabited by African Americans. And I checked with a person who has done some research on this, a friend of mine, and she said that a lot of it is due to the housing industry lobbying for increasing the number of houses that are constructed and the better quality. What happens is you're North Baton Rouge was once the place to be in Baton Rouge, a long, long time ago. But as more subdivisions were built around the city with newer technology, fancier stuff, and all that, everybody wanted those houses. Nobody wanted the ones in North Baton Rouge as much, and so the value went down. And that allows the lower income people to buy into those homes, which makes people less inclined to move there and drives the price down even more. So, So the thing with redlining or whatever, with the isolation and the inability of people in these neighborhoods to get credit to improve their houses or whatever, is largely based on the oversupply of housing or the excessive amount. Then, of course, another downside is the excessive paving and local flooding that we have here in Baton Rouge as a result of excess building. I mean, they're filling in, wetlands all over the place and drying up literally our drainage areas. But, and of course, there's also a downside of owning a house, as I discovered the first time I owned one, and owned it outright, as a matter of fact. I thought I'd be free with no mortgage. And I suddenly felt I had a ball and chain around my ankle. And Thoreau mentioned that in Walden. He compared the homes of the local Indians, which he said they could make the materials to construct one of their homes in half a day, construct it, and when they wanted to move somewhere else, take it all down and carry it with them to the next place. Whereas his, neighbors in town, if they wanted to leave, they had to get a mortgage to buy their house. They probably never would pay it off, and then they couldn't take it with them when they wanted to leave. So, and I remember thinking to myself, well, who's the civilized one here? Who's the smart people? Anyway, that's one of the lobby industries that have a negative impact on American society. And I wanted to add there too, there's the highway construction lobby for people, Caterpillar Tractor and all that. All those lumber companies, they all lobby governments at all levels to get more construction, more highway construction, things like that, because it's good for them, and of course the National Realtors Association and whatnot. And that just creates all this overbuilding that we have, and declining other properties. I live in an older neighborhood, so I'm sensitive to that. But anyway.
Yeah, well, on the flip side of lobbying for construction of more roads, there's lobbying against public transit. There's this article that came out just a few days ago, June 19th, 2018. So this is really up to date. This is a New York Times article about a campaign by Americans for Prosperity, which is one of the Koch brothers organizations that they use to influence legislation. It mounted a campaign against a proposal in Nashville, Tennessee, to add 1 cent sales tax to be used to fund public transit. And there's a number of things illustrated about this. One is how diligently they're working, because they produce gasoline and asphalt, so they're interested in keeping the cars in the highway industry going and fighting against anything that would reduce that flow of cash to their businesses.
Right.
And so they mounted this campaign in Nashville, Tennessee, where they use local people going door to door, targeting. Kind of sounds like the way that Cambridge Analytica did, where they were going specifically to people they had identified as most likely to be amenable to their argument against taxes for public transit.
Mm-hmm.
And they called, made 42,000 phone calls and knocked on more than 6,000 doors. And the measure was widely expected to pass, and then they were surprised when it was defeated.
And they used loaded questions, too. They didn't ask people straight out if they wanted mass transit. They'd said, do you really want your taxes increased, period.
Right. They had canvassers with scripts to read, and they were only going to go to speak to the registered voters. If somebody else came to the door, they were not to make their presentation if it wasn't the people they expected from their database. And they would start with, do you agree that raising the sales tax to the highest rate in the nation must be stopped? And ended with, can we count on you to vote no on the transit plan? So they were making this pitch that was expected to be persuasive with the individuals they had identified to target. And this was not an isolated campaign. According to this New York Times article, they have backed almost 24 other transit. They've mounted campaigns to oppose almost 24 other transit measures, including in Little Rock, where they made more than 39,000 calls and knocked on nearly 5,000 doors, in Utah, in Indiana, in New Jersey. So this was an effort, an ongoing effort. Like I said, this article just appeared yesterday.
Yeah. Well, and I remember back in the, I guess the 80s or 90s, Smithsonian Magazine did a lengthy article on how, I'm guessing back in the late 40s, early 50s, when the automobile industries really exploded, the automobile industries and the oil companies went around to the bigger American cities and bought up their mass transit systems and shut them down.
Right.
Precisely to promote the use of cars. And anybody who drives in Baton Rouge for any different part of the day during rush hours knows that we really could use some good mass transit here.
Yeah, it's much more difficult to retrofit, but that's what would be needed.
Yeah.
There was an article in Bloomberg Business Week that just came out showing how rapid they've been expanding mass transit in large cities in China. They are putting a lot of money into that.
Oh, yeah, the whole world is kicking our butts on infrastructure, even though we spend so much on it. But, yeah, America is way behind in roads, mass transit, speed trains, everything. We're pathetic, really, compared to the rest of the world. And a lot of it's because, I think you called it rent-seeking, where certain industries argue for, preferred status, which stifles competition and innovation.
Right. That's a concept I hadn't heard of before, but rent-seeking, as defined here, involves seeking to increase one's share of existing wealth without creating new wealth, which results in reduced economic efficiency. And one way that's done is through the capture of regulatory agencies to gain a coercive monopoly. But it's also done through seeking legislative enactments that would benefit the existing businesses that are doing this lobbying and prevent new, more advanced, more efficient, and cheaper alternatives. One example of rent-seeking was what Tesla has encountered as it's attempted to market its cars without local dealerships, and the existing auto industry has gone around to the various states seeking statewide legislation. I think this happened in Louisiana. I remember it being in the news a year ago or earlier this year. I forget which session it was, to require that cars be sold through dealerships in the state. You couldn't
kind of like
sell
the casket industry and the funeral business industries. They've lobbied for years for special licenses and restrictions on cremation and things like that.
Right.
And it could cost you $6,000 or more for a decent viewing and funeral. And I think that's being cut back now because they're pulling some of those regulations. We're going to talk a little bit about lobbying and incarcerations in America. We've talked about crime and punishment here lately. We know that America has the highest, by far, incarceration rate in the world, and Louisiana is now number 2. Oklahoma is the biggest, but Oklahoma and elsewhere in the country have been incarcerating women at an increasing rate. Incarcerating women, yeah. And, of course, the current immigration activities of the Trump administration are they're calling for an expansion of the prison networks of immigrant jails. In recent months, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has called for 5 new detention facilities to be built. And, and this is all, this ties in also the prison corporations, construction industries all lobby to keep marijuana illegal too. Partly, some of them will do it because they want to keep putting people in jail. They want these laws on the books to put people in jail. And if that's not a social ill, I don't know what is. But I want to get to that too in a second, although I think it's your turn for lobbyists. But I want to remind the listeners you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Give us a call. We're discussing lobbyists, and the effect that some of their issues have on American society as a whole. 343-9927, 343-9927. Give us a call. And Lang, do you have another favorite you want to share with us before I get to one of my favorites, marijuana legalization?
Well, I was just going to point out some numbers I came across on the fossil fuel industry. During the 2013-2014 legislative years, those 2 years, talk about a return on investment, the fossil fuel industry made campaign contributions of a little over $42 million. The lobbying for 2013 was over $156 million, and 2014 was over $151 million. So you add up what they spent on lobbying and contributions over that 2-year legislative term, it was about $350 million. During that same 2-year period, they received in federal production and exploration subsidies almost $42 billion. So I would say if you've got some spare change, you could invest in that and get that kind of return. That'd be a good place to put it. And that's a return on investment of almost 12,000%.
Right. Well, it's worth it then, huh? You know, and it's kind of saddens me. A lot of Americans, including this one, decry the co-opting of U.S. governments by major corporations. But this clearly shows that people with big money are largely they have excessive influence over all these processes. And getting back to the marijuana legalization movement, oh, by the way, did you know that Canada just today legalized marijuana?
I heard that.
So that's another area where America is once again falling behind the rest of the world. That in abortion rights, too. You know, Ireland just legalized it, or at least removed the prohibition of it. But not here, not here. But anyway, we're slowly getting marijuana legalized in various states. I think 15 of them so far in America have legalized. I'm not sure of that number, though. But the industries that are opposing marijuana legalization are the alcohol and beer companies, of course.
Of course.
They're number one. Police unions, because, hey, that's employment. You know, it's kind of like the prison industry. They want that. And, of course, private prison corporations, they've been lobbying against legalizing marijuana. And they put out a lot of nonsense, of course, and we hear it, and people believe it. But prison guard unions, of course, they're going to be in there. They want to keep people in jail and keep putting people in jail. And pharmaceutical corporations, because, oh gosh, I remember our current congressman when I lived in Mississippi, District 4, Gene Taylor. He would insist that there were no medical benefits to marijuana and that it was highly addictive, blah, blah, blah. And they keep finding new benefits of marijuana, you know, medical benefits. And it's really starting to get hard for them, I think, to keep promoting that nonsense. And hopefully that'll go away. But you know, here again, keeping marijuana illegal is one of the reasons why America leads the world in incarceration. Because so many people do it, you know, and you can't tell me that people in Congress aren't doing it. You know, they keep talking about drug testing welfare recipients. Well, how about we randomly test our congressmen too, or congresspeople, you know?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I mean, that might put an end to that nonsense real quickly, but...
Well, related to this, you just made me think of is prohibitions on doing research to show what the facts are. I mean, you've got that. You've got trying to shut down climate change research. You've got shutting down gun violent death research. It's like if you want to base your legislative policies, your government policies on what the facts are, you need to be doing research, not shutting it down.
Well, yeah, and we did a show a ways back on the accelerated approval of drugs in America by the FDA. And we found out that many of the people who were on the FDA evaluating committees, you know, approving these drugs, are from the pharmaceutical industries. It's kind of like the reverse revolving door thing.
Yeah, it's part of the revolving door, yeah. That's just the other side of it.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's like we're eating up with this corruption, really. I mean, as a libertarian, once I called it corruption. Yeah, that's right. But it is, even now as a bleeding heart liberal, I call it corruption because that's basically what it is. It's bribery. So yeah, then you mentioned climate denial. I'm looking at a Grist 50 article here. It says a report from Influence Map, a UK think tank, assessed the 50 biggest companies influencing climate policy, and 35 of them actively fight against climate-friendly legislation. And the ones they list here, the biggest ones they list here are Koch Industries, Dow, Duke Energy, Caterpillar, Comcast, General Motors, 20th Century Fox, and I'm not sure why, along with United Health Group. I don't understand why they would be against it. But Ford, BMW, General Electric, British Petroleum, Chevron, BASF, AT&T, CVS Health. But all these people are fighting any kind of legislation to reduce climate change. And, I think you and I both understand that climate change is definitely real. And so we can see what the negative consequences of all that's going to be.
Yeah, well, there's an article I'm looking at right now from 2016 talking about just what the fossil fuel industry has put into climate denial. At that point, they were reporting $115 million a year to oppose climate policy, with the leaders, the American Petroleum Institute, which is like the industry advocacy group, collectively spending $65 million a year, ExxonMobil 27, Shell 22. And on the counterbalance side, the supporters of climate change legislation were estimated to spend about $5 million a year.
Yeah.
So it's kind of...
And it's interesting, and I might have shared this with you a few months ago, but there was a book that came out in the 80s, I think, and it was a highly acclaimed history of the oil industry from the first discovery of oil, when we didn't really know what the heck to do with it, all the way up until the mid-1980s. And I recall in the book, Daniel Yergin wrote it. It was The Prize was the title of it. I forget the subtitle. But Daniel Yergin was the author, and I think it was in the 60s, but certainly it was at the latest in the 1970s when scientists were pointing out the dangers of our increase in hydrocarbon fossil fuel consumption because of the buildup of carbon dioxide and global warming. And this didn't even hit the media and the American public to any extent that I know of until the late 90s at least, maybe the early 2000s. I mean, I can recall within a relatively short period of time when it finally became a big thing, they started sounding the alarm, and apparently the fossil fuel industry has been denying it for 40 years.
Yeah, and there's some records that have been exposed showing that they were aware of it, decades before.
Yeah.
At the same time they were denying it, they already had their own scientists, kind of like the tobacco industry shown. And I think there's some lawsuits being, pending right now against some of those.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the great famous tobacco lawsuit where the tobacco companies were forced to pay huge fines to reimburse the government for all the negative health effects of smoking. And most of the states that I know of spent that money on other things. It was really just a big money grab from what I could see. I don't mean to defend the tobacco companies, but, our politicians had their hands in there too.
Yep. I think the word you used before was corruption.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like nowadays people have become inured to it. Is that the right word? They just accept it as, that's normal. Just like George Bush Sr., the gutless, shameless, unprincipled wimp, said that, that was just a campaign promise. Everybody knows that we lie in campaigns. It's like, oh, great, buddy,
Yeah.
I mean, it's true, but you shouldn't be admitting it outright like that as a politician.
I wish they'd admit it before the election.
Yeah. Well, that would defeat the purpose, right? So.
Yeah. That's why I wish they'd do it.
Right, but...
we've been talking about the money that we can trace, but there's also the dark money, which is the money we can't trace, and that's playing a bigger and bigger role.
Right, but that's free speech, right? corporations are people too, all that sort of thing, you know?
Yeah,
Okay.
so they say.
Yeah, that's so they say.
I haven't seen one.